February 1945, Mooshof, Germany. The Rhineland offensive was grinding Canadian soldiers into the frozen earth, and Sergeant Aubrey Cosens was about to do something that would make German soldiers question everything they knew about fear. This is the story of how one Canadian laughed when Germans captured him, then killed or captured 22 enemy soldiers in 45 seconds flat. The Queen's Own Rifles of Canada had been fighting for 3 brutal days without rest. The temperature had dropped to minus 12 degrees Celsius. Ice formed on rifle barrels. Men's breath froze on their scarves. The battalion had already lost 47 soldiers trying to take one small cluster of German farmhouses. Just 3 buildings, stone walls 2 feet thick, machine gun nests covering every approach. 3 separate attacks had failed in the past 18 hours alone. Men died crossing the same 50 yards of open ground again and again. The frozen bodies lay where they fell because nobody could reach them without getting shot. The officers were running out of ideas. Standard doctrine said infantry should wait for artillery to destroy enemy positions before attacking. But the artillery could not hit individual farmhouses in the darkness. The shells landed too far left or too far right, churning up frozen dirt while the Germans sat safe behind their stone walls. Tanks were supposed to lead attacks and blast through defenses, but German anti-tank guns had already destroyed 4 Sherman tanks that day. Their burning hulls still glowed orange in the night, marking the spots where Canadian crews had died. Some officers wanted to withdraw and wait for better conditions. Others suggested going around the position entirely. But Mooshof sat on the main road to the Rhine River. Whoever held those farmhouses controlled the road. There was no going around. Into this frozen nightmare stepped a 23-year-old sergeant from a place most people had never heard of. Aubrey Cosens came from Latchford, Ontario. The town had barely 300 people in it. Before the war, Cosens worked as a railroad section hand. He laid track and fixed rails in the wilderness of northern Ontario. His father drove locomotives for a living. His mother died when Aubrey was young. He had no fancy military training before 1940. He learned to be a soldier the hard way by surviving battles that killed men around him. The other soldiers noticed something strange about Cosens. He laughed when things got dangerous, not nervous giggles, real laughter, deep and loud, the kind of laugh that made Germans stare in confusion. His fellow soldiers called him Lucky Aubrey because bullets seemed to bend around him. He walked through firefights like nothing could touch him. His company commander thought he was reckless and would get himself killed. His men thought he was blessed by something they could not name. Maybe both were true. When dusk fell on February 25th, a German sniper shot the platoon commander through the head. The officer dropped without a sound. Cosens was now the only sergeant left standing. He looked at what remained of his platoon. 9 men out of the original 32. 9 exhausted, frozen soldiers who had watched their friends die for 3 days. 9 men who were told the farmhouses could not be taken. While the officers debated withdrawal on the radio, Cosens crawled forward alone into the darkness. He lay in the frozen mud for 2 hours, watching the German positions. And he noticed something that everyone else had missed. The Germans rotated their machine gun crews every 30 minutes. They had to. No man could sit behind a gun in that cold for longer without his fingers going numb. During each rotation, there was a gap. 40 to 50 seconds when the covering fire was weak. Cosens timed it 3 times to be sure. 32 minutes, 29 minutes, 31 minutes. The gap was always there. He also spotted something else. A Sherman tank sat behind a burned-out barn. It had thrown a track and could not move, but the tank was not destroyed. Its gun still worked. Its crew was still alive inside, waiting for someone to tell them what to do. Cosens saw a weapon that everyone else had written off as useless. He crawled back to his 9 men and told them his plan. They would attack during the 45-second gap. The disabled tank would provide covering fire. Cosens would run alongside it, directing the gunner by banging on the hull. They would cross 120 yards of open ground before the Germans could reset their machine guns. It was simple. It was desperate. It was probably suicide. Battalion headquarters would never approve an attack like this. Cosens knew it. His men knew it. But they also knew that waiting meant freezing. The 9 soldiers looked at their sergeant. They looked at the German farmhouses. They looked at the bodies of their friends lying in the snow. Then they checked their weapons and waited for Cosens to give the word. The attack would begin at 3 in the morning. In 5 hours, Aubrey Cosens would either be dead, or he would show the world what one man with a laugh in 45 seconds could do. Cosens gathered his 9 men in a shallow ditch behind the burned-out barn. The disabled Sherman tank sat 20 feet away, its engine idling to keep the crew from freezing. Steam rose from the exhaust and vanished into the black sky. The temperature had dropped to minus 15 degrees Celsius. Cosens could feel the cold seeping through his boots, numbing his toes. He did not have much time. None of them did. He explained his plan in simple terms. The Germans rotated their machine gun crews every 30 minutes. During each rotation, there was a gap of 40 to 50 seconds when their covering fire was weak. That gap was their only chance. The tank would move forward and blast the farmhouses while the infantry ran alongside. Cosens would direct the tank's fire from outside, banging on the hull to tell the gunner where to shoot. They would cover 120 yards of open ground in less than 40 seconds. If they moved fast enough, they would reach the first farmhouse before the German machine guns could reset. The men listened in silence. Their faces were pale in the darkness. Frost clung to their eyebrows and the stubble on their chins. One soldier, a private from Toronto who had joined the army at 17, asked what happened if the Germans finished their rotation early. Cosens looked at him and said nothing. They both knew the answer. If the timing was wrong, they would all die in the open like the soldiers who came before them. Cosens walked to the Sherman tank and climbed onto the hull. He knocked on the commander's hatch 3 times. The hatch creaked open and a face appeared. Corporal James Bradley had been sitting inside that steel box for 6 hours. His tank had thrown a track during the last failed attack. He could not move, but his gun still worked. He had been waiting for orders that never came. Now here was a sergeant with a plan that sounded like suicide. Cosens explained what he needed. The tank would advance at walking speed. Bradley would fire the main gun at any window or door that showed muzzle flash. The coaxial machine gun would sweep the ground between the farmhouses. Cosens would run beside the tank and bang on the armor to direct fire. 1 bang meant shoot left, 2 bangs meant shoot right, 3 bangs meant straight ahead. Bradley stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "If we are going to die," he said, "might as well die doing something useful." The attack was set for 3 in the morning. That gave them 4 hours to wait. 4 hours in the freezing darkness, watching their breath turn to ice, listening to German voices carry across the snow. Some of the men tried to sleep but could not. Others checked their weapons again and again. Cosens sat alone against the barn wall, his eyes fixed on the German positions. He was counting, timing the rotations 1 more time, making sure the gap was real. At 1 in the morning, the radio crackled. Battalion headquarters had heard about the plan. The voice on the other end was furious. "Who authorized this? Stand down immediately." A colonel was shouting now. "This is a direct order, Sergeant. You will hold position until reinforcements arrive at 0600. Proper artillery support will soften those positions first. Is that understood?" Cosens listened to every word. He acknowledged the order with the proper response. Then he switched off the radio and looked at his men. "We go at 3, he said quietly. Nobody argued. They had all seen what following orders got you in this war. But someone else was listening that night. Captain Roger Chicken commanded what was left of the company. He had survived 3 days of failed attacks and watched good men die following orders that did not work. When he heard Cosens on the radio, he made a decision. He would not stop the sergeant. Instead, he quietly called the mortar crews and gave them new instructions. At 1 minute past 3, they would fire illumination rounds over the German positions. The bright flares would blind the defenders for a few precious seconds. It was not much, but it might give Cosens the edge he needed. At 2:45, Cosens gathered his men one last time. He looked at each face in the darkness. 9 soldiers. Some had been fighting since Normandy. Others had joined as replacements just weeks ago. They were tired and cold and scared, but they were still alive, and they were willing to follow him into the fire. At exactly 3 in the morning, the Sherman tank lurched forward. Its engine roared in the silence. Cosens ran beside it, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. The 9 infantrymen spread out behind them, moving at a dead sprint. 120 yards of open ground lay ahead. German machine guns sat waiting in the darkness. The first German gun opened fire. Orange tracers streaked through the night, but the rhythm was wrong. The gun fired in short bursts, then stopped. The rotation was happening. Cosens had timed it perfectly. He banged on the tank hull 3 times. The 75mm gun roared. A farmhouse window exploded in a shower of stone and glass. German soldiers screamed inside. Cosens kept running. His lungs burned in the frozen air. His legs pumped beneath him. The distance closed. 100 yards, 80 yards, 60 yards. At 1 minute past 3, the sky turned white. Captain Chicken's illumination rounds burst overhead. The German defenders threw up their arms to shield their eyes. For 3 seconds, they could see nothing but blinding light. Cosens reached the first farmhouse in 38 seconds. He did not slow down. He lowered his shoulder and hit the wooden door with everything he had. The door crashed inward. Cosens stumbled into a room filled with smoke and dust and the smell of cordite. 6 German soldiers stood in front of him. Their rifles were pointed at his chest. For one frozen moment, nobody moved. The Germans shouted at him to surrender. They had him dead to rights. There was no escape. And then Aubrey Cosens did something that changed everything. He laughed. The laugh echoed off the stone walls like nothing the Germans had ever heard. It was not the sound of a man breaking. It was not hysteria. It was genuine laughter, full and loud, and ringing off the stone walls like he had just heard the funniest joke of his life. 6 German soldiers stood with their rifles pointed at Cosens' chest. They had him trapped. They had him dead. And this Canadian was laughing at them like they had just told him a funny joke. The German sergeant shouted again, "Surrender! Drop your weapon!" But his voice wavered. His eyes flickered with confusion. For one frozen second, every man in that room stood perfectly still. The Germans did not understand what they were seeing. No sane man laughed at death. No soldier smiled when 6 rifles aimed at his heart. They hesitated. They tried to make sense of it. And in that moment of hesitation, Aubrey Cosens moved. He threw himself sideways and fired his Sten gun from the hip. The weapon bucked in his hands. 4 Germans fell before they could pull their triggers. The other 2 dove behind a heavy wooden table, shouting in panic. Cosens did not slow down. He charged the table at full speed and hit it with his shoulder. The table flipped over and crashed against the wall. The 2 Germans tumbled with it. They looked up to see the barrel of the Sten gun 6 inches from their faces. Their hands shot into the air. They were done fighting. 12 seconds. That is how long Cosens spent in the first farmhouse. He grabbed one of his men, who had followed him through the door, and pointed at the prisoners. "Guard them." Then he ran back outside into the freezing night. The Sherman tank had already put 2 rounds through the walls of the second farmhouse. Stone and plaster lay scattered across the snow. A hole the size of a man gaped in the side of the building. Cosens sprinted toward it. His boots slipped on the ice. His breath came in ragged gasps. He could hear German voices inside, shouting orders, trying to organize a defense. He dove through a shattered window and landed hard on a floor covered with broken glass. This had been a kitchen before the tank shells hit. Pots and pans lay twisted on the ground. A stove had been knocked sideways. 8 German soldiers crouched among the wreckage, grabbing for their weapons. Cosens fired before his feet were even under him. 3 Germans dropped. 2 more fell wounded, clutching their legs and screaming. The remaining 3 soldiers looked at this Canadian who had appeared out of nowhere like a demon from the smoke. They dropped their rifles and raised their hands. Their faces were white with terror. 15 seconds. 8 more Germans down. Cosens left his men to secure the prisoners and turned toward the 3rd farmhouse. This was the biggest building, the command post, the place where the German officer controlled everything, the most dangerous target of all. He was alone now. His 9 soldiers were spread across the first 2 buildings, guarding prisoners and clearing rooms. Cosens ran across 60 yards of open ground by himself. German bullets kicked up frozen dirt around his boots. A machine gun somewhere to his left opened fire. Tracers streaked past his head, so close he felt the heat on his cheek. He did not stop. He did not slow down. He just ran. The Sherman tank followed behind him, its gun roaring. Another shell slammed into the 3rd farmhouse. The back door exploded inward in a shower of splinters. Cosens jumped through the opening before the dust could settle. 8 German soldiers waited inside. Some were trying to reload their weapons. Others were crawling toward a staircase. An officer stood in the corner, shouting into a field telephone. Cosens raised his Sten gun and pulled the trigger. The gun bucked and roared. 3 Germans fell. Then 4. Then 5. The Sten gun clicked empty. Cosens dropped it and drew his pistol in one smooth motion. He fired twice more. A German soldier spun and collapsed. Another dropped his rifle and threw up his hands. The officer in the corner looked at Cosens with wide, disbelieving eyes. Then he slowly raised his hands too. 18 seconds. The 3rd farmhouse was clear. Cosens stood in the middle of the room, breathing hard. The smell of cordites burned his nose. His ears rang from the gunfire. Blood pooled on the wooden floor, steaming in the frozen air. German prisoners sat against the walls with their hands on their heads. They stared at the single Canadian soldier who had destroyed their entire position. Outside, the Sherman tank's engine rumbled. Its gun barrel still smoked. Canadian voices shouted in the darkness. Somewhere in the building, a German soldier was crying. 45 seconds. That is how long it took Aubrey Cosens to clear all 3 farmhouses. 22 German soldiers killed or captured by one man with a Sten gun and a laugh that froze his enemies in place. The numbers told the story better than words ever could. Before Cosens attacked, 3 Canadian assaults had failed. 47 men had died or been wounded trying to take these buildings. After Cosens attacked, the position fell in under 2 minutes. 14 Germans were killed. 6 were wounded. 8 more surrendered. Canadian casualties during the assault were 0. Not one of the 9 soldiers who followed Cosens was hit. His impossible plan had worked perfectly. As dawn broke over Mooshof, pink light spread across the frozen landscape. The German farmhouses were silent now. Canadian soldiers moved through the wreckage, collecting weapons and tending to wounded prisoners. Cosens stood in the doorway of the 3rd farmhouse directing his men. He was telling them where to set up defensive positions. His voice was calm. His hands were steady. The battle was over. A single rifle shot cracked across the frozen morning. The bullet came from somewhere in the trees to the east. It traveled faster than sound. Cosens never heard it. The round struck him in the head, and he dropped where he stood. He was dead before he hit the ground. His men searched for the sniper for hours. They never found him. Whoever pulled that trigger vanished like a ghost. Aubrey Cosens, the man who laughed at death and won, was killed by an enemy he never saw. He was 23 years old. The battle for Mooshof was his last. The soldiers of the Queen's Own Rifles carried Aubrey Cosens' body back to Canadian lines as the sun climbed higher over Mooshof. They wrapped him in a blanket and lifted him gently, like he was sleeping instead of gone forever. The 9 men who had followed him into battle walked beside the stretcher. None of them had a scratch. Not one bullet had touched them during the attack. Their sergeant had led them through impossible odds and brought them all back alive. Then a single shot from a hidden sniper took him away. The position at Mooshof was held. The road to the Rhine River was finally open. Canadian forces advanced 12 miles in the next 48 hours, pushing deeper into Germany than they had moved in weeks. The 3 farmhouses that had cost 47 men over 3 days fell in under 2 minutes because one sergeant refused to wait for orders that would never come. The breakthrough at Mooshof helped crack the German defensive line. The war in Europe would end in just over 2 months. Word of what Cosens did spread quickly through the Canadian army. Officers who had doubted him read the reports with disbelief. 22 Germans killed or captured in 45 seconds, 3 fortified buildings cleared by essentially one man, 0 casualties among the attackers. The numbers did not seem real, but the witnesses were still alive to tell the story. The German prisoners were still sitting in holding camps, still shaking their heads about the Canadian who laughed when he should have died. The British Army announced that Sergeant Aubrey Cosens would receive the Victoria Cross. It was the highest award for bravery that any soldier in the British Commonwealth could earn. The citation described his outstanding gallantry and initiative. It told how he personally directed a tank while under heavy fire. It explained how he killed or captured at least 20 enemy soldiers in close combat. It called his actions an inspiration to his men and a decisive factor in the success of the operation. King George VI presented the medal at Buckingham Palace in London, but Aubrey Cosens was not there to receive it. His father stood in his place. The old locomotive engineer from Latchford, Ontario, a town of 300 people in the northern wilderness, walked into the palace and stood before the King of England. His hands shook as he accepted the bronze cross on its crimson ribbon. His son had left home as a railroad worker and died as one of the most decorated soldiers in Canadian history. The father carried that medal back to Latchford and kept it until his own death. The town never forgot its hero. They renamed the main street Cosens Street. A sign still stands there today, marking the road where Aubrey walked as a boy. In British Columbia, a mountain was named Mount Cosens. Its peak rises above the wilderness like a monument that will last forever. The Queen's Own Rifles of Canada hold ceremonies every year to honor his memory. Young soldiers who were not yet born when Cosens died stand at attention and listen to the story of what he did. His Victoria Cross sits in the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. Thousands of visitors see it every year. A small replica hangs in the town hall of Latchford, where the people who knew him can still remember his face. But it was the laugh that soldiers talked about most. For decades, veterans who survived that night told the story of the moment when Cosens stood with 6 rifles pointed at his chest and laughed in the faces of his captors. Why did he do it? What was he thinking? The answers varied depending on who you asked. Some said it was madness. The human mind can only take so much fear and death before it breaks. Maybe Cosens had reached his limit and something inside him snapped. Others said it was calculated. Cosens knew that hesitation kills in combat. He needed the Germans to freeze for just 1 second. The laugh was a weapon, as deadly as any bullet. It confused his enemies long enough for him to move. A soldier who had known Cosens well offered a different explanation. Aubrey always laughed when he was scared, the man said years later. It was his way of telling fear to go to hell. He was not crazy. He was not calculating. He was just a man who refused to let death see him flinch. The German prisoners who survived that night gave their own accounts during interrogation. One of them said something that captured the truth better than any official report. "We did not understand what we were seeing," the German told his captors. "A man who laughs when he should beg for his life. We did not know how to fight that, so we hesitated, and that hesitation killed us." The Canadian military studied what Cosens did at Mooshof for years afterward. His tactics became training examples. The way he used a disabled tank as mobile fire support while directing from outside was taught to new officers. His analysis of enemy rotation patterns influenced how scouts gathered information. The Queen's Own Rifles developed what they called Cosens drills for clearing buildings in close combat. Move fast, hit hard, never give the enemy time to think. Modern Canadian soldiers still learn these lessons today. But the deeper lesson of Aubrey Cosens goes beyond military tactics. He had no formal officer training. He was a railroad worker from a town most people had never heard of. He saw something that trained commanders missed. He acted when orders told him to wait. He led from the front when doctrine said to lead from behind. His story asks a question that matters far beyond any battlefield. Do we train people to think for themselves? Or do we train them to follow rules even when the rules are failing? War is chaos. Plans fall apart. Leaders die. Communication breaks down. In those moments, everything depends on individuals who can think and adapt and act. Aubrey Cosens had 45 seconds to change the outcome of a battle. He did not have time to ask permission. He did not have time to consult a manual. He had only his instincts, his courage, and a laugh that told death it would have to wait. If you drive through Latchford, Ontario today, you will pass Cosen Street. It is a quiet road in a quiet town that most Canadians will never visit. But on a frozen night in February 1945, a young man from that town stood in a German doorway with rifles pointed at his heart, and he laughed. In that laugh was everything that separates ordinary people from extraordinary ones. Not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear decide. Not the desire for glory, but the will to bring his men home alive. Aubrey Cosens was 23 years old when he died. He had lived long enough to show us what courage really means. It means laughing in the face of death, and then it moves.